Welcome, everybody. We're going to launch into this event with a little welcome from Professor Scott Davidson, who is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University. Thanks for coming, Scott.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'd like to wish a very warm welcome to you all and to thank you for inviting me to open the symposium. I couldn't think of anything better to do on a sunny June morning. It is, however, rather daunting when speaking to people who've got much more expertise about Orwell than I will ever have. However, I think it's fair to say that George Orwell has been one of the very influential people in my life. I think I can say quite clearly that he had a profound effect upon my own sense of social responsibility and also my political consciousness. You might not believe it, but, and of course you could probably see from my vintage that I'm of the 1950s, or maybe not. But one of the very first passages that I remember reading at primary school was from George Orwell's Burmese Days. And of course, the books in the Orwell canon that we read at school, and which in fact I was so enthralled by that I extended my reading of Orwell outside the curriculum, Eat Your Heart Out, Mr. Gove, was of course 1984, Animal Farm. Nobody made us keep the aspidistra flying, nobody made us read Burmese Days. But my goodness me, I thoroughly enjoyed each and every one of them. And of course, coming to the symposium has prompted in my mind probably the need to go back to some of those books. But when I was at university, I shared the room with a guy called Frank. And Frank was from Wigan. And of course, he used to like to make a play on the Orwell statement, you know, Wigan has no peer. And I said, what do you mean Wigan has no peer? He said, well, actually, what I really mean is Wigan is without peer. So I think, I'm not sure how many people you could share that particular joke with these days. But it's, I think Orwell's impact on British thought, British life, the way we look at things, his personal political commitments, his moving writing about the Spanish Civil War and homage to Catalonia, all these things I think have added up to make him really one of our most significant national treasures. And I wonder what he would have made of some elements of contemporary culture. So I'm going to leave you with a conundrum.
Okay.
Should we put room 101 into room 101?
Thank you for that. That will be the question of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Scott, my sincere thanks to you for coming and sharing that about Orwell. Now, I very briefly will do my formal welcome to everyone, keynoters, speakers, audience. A special thanks to Suzanne Etherington, who you see is absolutely vital for the smooth functioning of the event, and to Dominic Darnell here, one of my investigative students. We have the only investigative BA in the country, and Dominic was on it this year. So I hope that's all right with all the speakers, that this is being filmed, and it will go up on YouTube. Is that acceptable to all the speakers? Yes. Good. Right, how come we're all sitting here? In effect, it's a kind of a dream for me to be able to organise this event. I've been able to do it because I won in 2011 a National Teaching Fellowship Award, which has given me quite a bit of money. I've been to a conference in Canada. I spoke at 7 universities in Australia last year, and I've still got money, and some of it is paying for this. So amongst Orwell obsessives, as we all are, what a great fest we will have today. For me, personally, as well, Orwell is known as a novelist, Animal Farm, 1984, an essayist, but for me, first and foremost, Orwell was a journalist, and he has been an inspiration to me throughout my professional career as a journalist, and I've tried to inspire my students equally with a love of Orwell. What amazing stuff one can learn from Orwell's writing. I've written a bit about Orwell. I edited a collection of essays. I've looked at his coverage of the 1945 war on the continent. I've looked at his rather extraordinary, ambivalent relationship with the intelligence services, and hopefully another book will come out of this event. I hope the speakers will translate their talks into chapters. Other people have already said, who couldn't come today, that they will give us chapters, and so there should be a good book coming out of this as well. Peter Lang, the New York publishers, have said that they will publish. As chair, I will be able to time everyone. So most keynoters have half an hour. I guess that'll be 25 minutes, and then 5 minutes for questions. Other speakers will have 20 minutes, I guess 15 minutes to present and 5 minutes for talk. I will discreetly utter words like 3 minutes left, 1 minute left. Please clear the podium. Just to keep control of things, there's a bit of space opened up in the afternoon because one of our speakers, Tom Murden, unfortunately is ill, sends his apologies, so that gives a bit of freedom. So, a bit of housekeeping matters. In the unlikely event of a fire or alarm, run. There's one at the back, there's that there, and there's that there, okay? There is an alarm not due. We obviously have regular alarms to check the bell works. It's not due to go today. Again, loos are down that corridor at the, on the right. I think that's everything. So now we start. It's my enormous privilege to welcome Richard Blair. I got to know Richard through my involvement in the Orwell Society, where I've met other Orwell obsessives, and we organise events. We've got a newsletter. Richard takes people up to Jura, that in fact just come down from there. He may even talk about that. But Richard has obviously the experience of growing up a few years with George Orwell. So for me, a connection with this great man comes through Richard. I was lucky enough to interview David Astor, who was his great editor at The Observer and Manchester Evening News, and again, it was a way of connecting with Orwell. So I think everybody's come to hear you, Richard. So let's welcome Richard Blair.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What I want to do is very simple, in fact. I'm just going to go through Orwell's life in a chronological order from birth through to death with one or two personal remarks. So it's nothing very heavy, and I may even have to take out little bits because the presentation I have here tends to run on for about 40 odd minutes, so I will take out what I think is perhaps not quite so relevant. It was a bright, cold day in April. Winston Smith, with his chin nuzzled into his chest, hurried through the doors of Victory Mansions. This was the beginning of 1984, one of the more iconic books of the 20th century. What we're seeing here is a facsimile of the original manuscript. All his manuscripts had been destroyed on his instruction, but somehow half of 1984 survived. And in the early 80s, Peter Davison, who is a lecturer in history at the De Montfort University in Leicester, obtained the manuscript, and what he did was he went through and photocopied all the pages, and he then created a fair copy on the other side, and it's a very large tome. Unfortunately, it would be very difficult to get a hold of this book now. But what he did was he went through the original manuscript and identified all the copy marks, the blotches, the stains, versus the crossings out and the rewritings. So we get an idea here of how my father's mind worked. He was a perfectionist to the best of his ability. He would write something down, he would then cross it out. I'm not going to go through the rest of this because you might be able to come across this someday. But you can see his mind working. He would write something down, he would then say, no, that wasn't quite right, I have to do it again and again and again. Bearing in mind that, of course, he was also, at the time in the 1946, 47, 48, 49, suffering from TB. He was getting progressively more and more ill. So he had to work very hard at this. So who was this man, George Orwell? Well, I will refer to him as Orwell in my little talk. He was born in 1903 to Richard and Ida Blair. He was the middle child of three. He had an older sister, Marjorie, who was born in 1899. He was born on the 25th of June, 1903, and he had a younger sister, April, who was born in 1908. He was born in Mutihari in northern India, and at the age of, well, at that time, his father was the third secretary to the opium department in the Indian Civil Service. At that time, of course, Great Britain controlled the opium trade to China. He then decided to send his family home, and here we have father, who was much older than his wife. We have Eric Arthur Blair, of course, as he was known then in those days, and his younger sister Avril with mother. They came home, and although my father stayed in India, they came home, and the children and their mother settled down near Henley-on-Thames, and there he grew up.
I'm talking today about, as you see in the title, George Orwell and the history of surveillance studies. As with most people, my first sensitivity to surveillance issues came on reading Orwell's 1984. When I tell people that I'm studying surveillance, and in particular investigating the ways in which personal details are stored in computer databases, the most common reaction is to invoke George Orwell. This must be about Big Brother, people say. Looking back over the discourse of surveillance and technology over the last 50 years, it's difficult to overestimate the impact of Orwell's novel on popular and academic imaginations. Big Brother is probably the most famous bogeyman and symbol of a surveillance society. Now, most of you are likely to find these words uncontroversial, even somewhat obvious. It's important for the argument that I'm going to make in this paper, I'm going to sketch in this paper though, that these words are not my own. As I can now reveal, or start to reveal, they come from four important works on surveillance studies written by scholars over the last 40 years. The first is, and if you can read that, yes, possibly you can read it, The first is from James Rawls' Private Lives, Public Surveillance, a work recognised as one of the foundational texts of what is still a relatively new field of surveillance studies. Rawls' work was published in 1973, and in it he compares the real situation of societies in the US and the UK to the fictional world of Oceania in 1984. Rawls uses the novel as a type of Weberian ideal model by which to calibrate the level and scope of surveillance in the early 1970s in the real world of the US and the UK. And in his concluding remarks, he observes that, this is the quote high up there, present-day systems of mass surveillance and control, like those studied here in his book, share many of the sociological qualities of the single mass surveillance system depicted in 1984. Though, of course, they're much less powerful, and they do not necessarily pursue the same malevolent purposes. But the fact that he chooses a fictional work, 1984, as a yardstick says much about that novel's ability to convey something to a social scientist about the reality of surveillance in the 1970s. The second quotation, as you'll see up there, comes from David Lyon's The Electronic Eye, first published in 1994. Lyon is now, I think, pretty much recognised as the authority in surveillance studies. His research over more than 2 decades has had an enormous influence on the field, on the scope and direction of surveillance studies as an academic pursuit. He's written more than half a dozen major works on various aspects of surveillance, as you can see from the list here, ranging from ID cards to the monitoring of international borders, surveillance in a post-9/11 world, privacy, risk, and digital discrimination. He's one of the editors of the Routledge Handbook of Surveillance, published in 2012. And if we can be a little bit cynical for a moment about academia, we might recognise that a handbook from a major publisher is an important register that an emerging academic field has finally and publicly emerged. More recently still, Lyon has published Liquid Surveillance, based on a series of conversations with the renowned sociologist Sigmund Bauman. And while his comments about how people presume that he's working on Orwell are now 20 years, Orwell and Big Brother are now 20 years old, Orwell still provides a reference point in the world of liquid surveillance that Bauman and Lyon explore in that book. Benjamin Gould's recognition in his book CCTV and Policing, which came out in 2004, his recognition a decade after Lyon about the massive and enduring impact of Orwell on popular and academic imaginations over half a century comes with a sting in the tail. Gould accepts that Orwell has been, quote, instrumental in shaping the way many criminologists and social theorists now think about questions of surveillance and its role in contemporary society. But Gould is a self-confessed empiricist, and he advises those criminologists and social theorists to concentrate their research on the actual world rather than drift away into the fictional. The alternative might be, he warns, that theoretical literature of social control will become increasingly divorced from reality. Though this recognition by Gould of the massive impact of 1984, this is in 2004, over the previous 50 years, but certainly talking to his fellow social scientists, urging them to move away from the fictional to the real. And his point is methodologically entirely valid, of course, but does not seem to have been followed through by some of his social science colleagues. A very short list in the middle of the slide suggests Orwell in 1984 continued to be invoked or evoked by surveillance scholars, including the leading academic Mike Nellis, who in 2009, so after Gould's called 1984 the text of surveillance, the text that we go back to as the kind of starting point. Nellis's chapter on the literary representation of surveillance since 1984, the title is there, appeared in New Directions in Surveillance and Privacy, published that same year, 2009. One of the editors was the man who said we shouldn't look at these things, Benjamin Gould. So Gould in 2004 says move away from it. In 2009 accepts that we can't, in a sense. So there's a chapter in the book he edits that deals with 1984 and those works post-1984. In a sense, we might think of Big Brother as, to quote a far more famous person with a similar surname to me, as the ghost or the spectre haunting surveillance studies. Something particularly or seemingly confirmed by John Gilliam's and Torrin Monaghan's admission last year that Big Brother is probably the most famous bogeyman and symbol of a surveillance society. They don't, however, come to praise Big Brother, but to bury him. In the contemporary world of mobile phones with cameras, big data, which fairly obviously echoes consciously Big Brother, of credit cards and Facebook, where we actively and cheerfully provide information in order to travel the world, as I've done, use credit cards, purchase goods, connect with friends, and share personal and hitherto private details. The type of purely negative, state-centered, ideologically underpinned surveillance depicted in 1984 is outdated and in some ways misleading. That's the main argument they make against 1984 Big Brother. And of course there's something to be said for this critique. And it speaks to a long-running unease that surveillance scholars have had about 1984, even while they recognise its cultural power. David Lyon, for example, as far back as 1994, argued that the dystopian aspect of surveillance that finds its most emblematic and resonant form in Orwell's work denied the positive aspects of surveillance. The ability, say, to create databases that might allow effective social security systems, track medical histories, aid the international movement of people, enable online purchases. So in 1994, Lyon talks about the fact that an Orwellian model is too and almost entirely negative. And in fact, surveillance enables a whole variety of things. It enables people to move safely between countries that provide security, etc., etc. It allows us to make purchases, as we do. Kevin Haggerty and Richard Erickson, two other surveillance scholars more recently, have written that no single Orwellian Big Brother oversees the massive monetary effort that is surveillance in the 21st century. But they've also argued against the other model that came through in the 80s and 90s, the panopticon model made famous by Michel Foucault, on the grounds that it too, that model, suggests a monolithic, negative surveillance power spread through social networks and practices that reduces citizens to docile bodies. So they have an alternative. They use Gilles Deleuze. I won't go into that, but essentially the idea that surveillance is spread far more through society and isn't under the control of a single state. So we actually use surveillance ourselves, that we're part of a rather more fluid network. The failure to integrate computer technology into the analysis of surveillance power is more telling in the case of Foucault, of course. Orwell died at the very dawn of the computer age, and so hardly could be faulted for not incorporating it into his projection. But it does constitute a substantial gap in the way surveillance is depicted and assessed in 1984 relative to our current situation, and I think that has to be recognised. Yet though the computer has in many ways supplanted the camera, or supplemented and perhaps supplanted the camera as the most powerful and ubiquitous surveillance technology, Orwell's vision still holds considerable sway, both in academia and more importantly, I think, with the public. And I use that term vision consciously for two reasons. First, because visual surveillance is still powerful and important. Of course, one of the things that's always rattled about the UK is that it's has the most CCTV cameras per head of population in the world. So this visual surveillance is still important. And it's often the obvious way in which people, in a sense, come in contact with surveillance in their lives. This doesn't mean that the world that Orwell writes about in the 1940s mirrors our own. Indeed, it's possible to argue that today 1984 functions, as it did in the work of James Rule back at the beginning of surveillance studies, as a means of measuring the difference between fiction and reality. So it gives us an interesting model, but it doesn't, in a sense, attend to the reality for most of us of surveillance in the 21st century. Today, for example, people, or many people, feel safer under the watchful eye of CCTV cameras, comforted by the fact that state or private operatives monitor them, or what we might assume would be surprised by this development. Many people are comforted by CCTV cameras, but of course not all are. And it's telling that two recent scholarly studies on surveillance Simon Chesterton's One Nation Under Surveillance, a new social contract to defend freedom without sacrificing liberty, and Lisa Nelson's America Identified, Biometric Technology and Society, begin by quoting these chilling words from the early pages of 1984. You had to live, did live from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every word you made was every sound you made was overheard, and except in darkness, every movement scrutinized. Yet these words still retain a disturbing charge, which I'm sure they do. It's also true that in the contemporary world, in the world that we inhabit, as a consequence of platforms like Facebook and Instagram, camera phones and other forms of peer surveillance, many people in our specular culture are far more comfortable being seen, whatever that might mean, than was the case even a decade ago. One of the most fascinating aspects of this change, one that reverses the dynamic in Oceania in one sense, is that some people not only want to be more visible, far more regularly than before, but that in our celebrity culture actually are willing to compete for prizes on reality TV shows that require that they are constantly monitored, constantly watched. And historically, the most famous of these is the global phenomenon that was or is, I think I saw on TV, that is Big Brother starting up again here again?
Yes.
Okay. Well, we haven't quite got really, yeah, this is the Australian version, so just so that you know it is a global phenomenon, at least was one. In our world, interestingly, surveillance has become entertainment, and we, in a sense, are the thought police looking through people. We're the ones who are not only enjoying that, there's a voyeuristic element to it, but we're also getting involved in the ads that require us or encourage us to buy products in the ad breaks, etc., etc., etc. The fact that Big Brother, the show, upended the logic of 1984 was less important in terms of surveillance studies than the fact of the novel's obvious brand recognition that they contained, even if they were misusing it in a sense, turning it inside out. The fact that 1984 still fairly obviously had brand recognition when people thought about surveillance.
When you look at Orwell, the man is unbelievably interesting. He's fascinated me since I was a student. In terms of the way in which research is likely to develop most productively, I think we can still discuss all sorts of things about different interpretations of Orwell's known positions. But I think what Les said is the most productive area, the influences on Orwell. And certainly, there is some interesting work being done on that. I would just like to say, as a sort of plug, that I've always felt that Franz Borkenau deserves attention. And, if there's anyone here who fancies writing something on Franz Borkenau, I will be very eager to read it, because it does seem to me that he's an influence on Orwell, an important thinker in his time, who is really, really neglected. Another influence, I think, which is neglected is the Adelphi magazine, which there is very little on, and yet not only did Orwell write for this, but I think this was an influence on Orwell as well. And this is something that needs to be explored. I'm not going to do it, but I want someone else to do it so I can read what they have to say. In terms of this discussion, what prompted me to look at Orwell's ideas about socialism was Robert Cole's recent book, George Orwell, English Rebel. So I read this book, and we look at the same material, and I know Rob. And at the end of the book, I thought, well, how can we disagree quite so strongly when we're looking at exactly the same material? Obviously, I'm right, he's wrong. But nevertheless, we'll take that as said. But that prompted me to go back and actually try to systematise, if you like, Orwell's ideas on socialism as far as I could. Now, the first point, of course, is that, like all lives, Orwell's life was a work in progress. His ideas develop in terms of experience, in terms of reading, in terms of all sorts of influences. Ideas change. You do find, for example, on some occasions, Orwell will make a point at one time in his life, and then later on will condemn this in unreserved terms. On one occasion in the 30s, he refers to British democracy rests on coolie labour, not counting niggers article. Later on, he attacks the Communist Party for saying that British democracy rests on coolie labour. It's not that simple, he says. We all do this. I'm sure we all do this. Fortunately, most of us aren't going to have everything we've ever written collected and exposed to the public, which is what happens to Orwell. I only want to focus on one aspect of what Rob Coles has to say, which is when he argues that Orwell's embrace of Labourism, which he absolutely celebrates, was because the Labour government of 1945-51 actually enacted the programme that Orwell was arguing for in the early 40s. That the programme that Orwell advanced in The Lion and the Unicorn, and that Orwell argued needed a revolution, in fact, what Orwell came to see was that this programme was realised both under the Churchill coalition and later on under the Labour government in 1945-51. And I didn't agree with this when I was reading Rob's book, and I went back to the material to see, you know, please God let me be right. And I think I was right and Rob is wrong. What you find in The Lion and the Unicorn, you know, this was a period when Britain was fighting the war without allies. The United States was neutral. The Soviet Union was allied with Nazi Germany. And what Orwell argues in Lion and the Unicorn in a number of articles is that in fact what Britain needs is a social revolution, not a Bolshevik-type revolution, and not Labour reformism. He tries to argue for an English way, if you like, but nevertheless he did actually write that the gutters would have to run with blood. You know, and this was not something he said lightly. I think he actually meant it at that time. Because the old order could not defeat the Nazis, both because of its incompetence, the old capitalist system had failed, the people running the country, he said it's, you know, a family with the wrong people in control, these people had to be got rid of, and he actually argues on a number of occasions that, you know, we will not get the coloured peoples, the phrase he uses at the time, fighting for us if it's still the old empire, we will not be able to raise the standard of revolution on the continent. Orwell argued it had to be a revolutionary movement on the continent that would overthrow the Nazis, because there wasn't the Russians involved and there wasn't the United States involved. The only way forward was some sort of European revolution. And in fact, you know, Orwell was not alone in thinking this. When the Special Operations Executive was established, it was established with that understanding as well. You know, Churchill's phrase was they had to set Europe ablaze. So it wasn't just Orwell arguing this sort of thing, but I don't think Churchill quite envisaged the same sort of transformation of society that Orwell was hoping for. You know. In fact, of course, when the SOE did get going, by and large, it actually had to rely on people on the left to make up the backbone of not all, but most resistance movements. Not all, certainly. So, you know, Orwell argues a very radical case. He argues it in The Lion and the Unicorn, which was part of the Searchlight series of books. And, you know, the whole series are worth reading, in my opinion. William Connors one, The English at War. Connors was a famous Daily Mirror correspondent, Cassandra. The Daily Mirror was actually a very, you know, carried very serious articles in that day. It still does, to be fair. You know, the Daily Mirror still, along with all the sort of, what would you call it, all the celebrity crap, still carries some quite weighty campaigning articles. These people argued that Britain would only win the war if there was radical social change, if you had in fact some sort of socialist revolution. You know, this was argued absolutely categorically. And Orwell made the point in Left News that the scale of change that you know, was necessary was such that the rich would resist it violently. You know, the rich would resist it violently, and that resistance would have to be put down, and it could be put down because they had armed the people. As I'm sure people know, this was the Home Guard. You know, Orwell didn't see the Home Guard as Dad's army. Orwell and a number of other people, he wasn't alone in this, actually saw it as potentially a revolutionary force. Now, that doesn't happen, but I think if Britain had been occupied, or if you'd had a Quisling government installed in power, then elements within the Home Guard might well have become some sort of revolutionary force. So the thing was, you know, dependent on circumstances rather than him being just per se wrong. Now, the programme in The Lion and the Unicorn is quite interesting. It's very radical. I think Coles completely underestimates how radical it is. First of all, he says all urban land will be nationalised. And when he says nationalised, he means expropriated. Doesn't mean there'll be generous compensation. He means the rich will have their wealth taken off them and they won't have anything given in return. They're just going to be expropriated. all urban land. He imposes a very small limit on the amount of rural land that anyone will be able to own. This is very radical. You imagine how the Duke of Westminster would take this. In other volumes, he actually argues, how can you ask people to fight in order to preserve other searchlight volumes, the Duke of Westminster's holdings in London? People are being asked to die so the Duke of Westminster can still be a great landlord. I think he's the 5th richest man in Britain still. His descendant still the 5th richest. Dan Snow is married to his daughter. Never liked Dan Snow, even though he's a great historian. I thought that'd be a laugh, but still, never mind. You know, he argues for the expropriation, once again, of all the major industries, the expropriation of the financial system, and he actually says what we need is a ratio of incomes where no one earns more than 10 times the salary of the lowest paid. This is a very radical programme, and I think Orwell was quite right that any attempt to introduce such a programme by any sort of mass movement would have been resisted violently. You know, even in Britain, I think it would have been resisted violently. He didn't think it would require something like a Russian revolution. He rejected the Bolshevik model of organisation, absolutely, but nevertheless, you know, I think this is a very radical programme. And it certainly wasn't implemented by either the coalition government or by the Labour government of 1945-51. He insists that one important facet of this revolution is the democratisation of the education system. The great public schools have to be nationalised, and most private schools have to be shut down. No ambiguity about this. The 1944 Education Act did not do that, and I don't think anyone would seriously argue that it has happened today either. You know, that this is not, there hasn't been a democratisation of the education system in that sense. And Orwell himself, writing when the Labour government is in power, actually makes the point we haven't seen any democratisation of the education system. What I think happens, you know, is that Orwell comes to the conclusion, quite correctly, there isn't going to be a revolution. It's not going to happen. Russia and America come into the war, the British establishment can actually coast to victory, if you like, on the coattails of these great powers. So they've managed to stifle revolution in Britain. He thought revolution was imminent, it doesn't happen, and he tries to explain it away in his own terms. He also is very critical of the Labour Party for being so timid. He actually says that they're very timid, that there's very little difference between them and the Conservatives, and you do get the impression that all they want to do is to draw their salaries and play musical chairs with the Conservatives in terms of being in power, which I think has a very contemporary ring to it, to be honest. But nevertheless, you know, he's very critical. But what I think he concludes is that, in fact, in Britain, in the circumstances as they unfold, there is no alternative to the Labour Party. And you get Orwell embrace Tribune, and becomes, the phrase I would use, I'm not sure whether Paul will agree, but I see him as an outrider, if you like, on the left of the Labour Party. Even though, you know, there's no doubt he becomes a strong supporter of the Labour Party, nevertheless I would argue that he still is engaged with the harder left ideas, I suppose, that he had embraced earlier on. They are still there, and there is still a debate with them. I would argue very strongly that these ideas influence Animal Farm. Animal Farm really is a sort of Trotskyist anarchist take on the Russian Revolution. 1984, you know, the idea of oligarchical collectivism is a phrase lifted from a heretical Trotskyist movement in the States. There's also an influence from Bork now. He was friends with some of these people. Burnham had originated as one of these people. James Burnham had been a Trotskyist for a while. These are influences that Orwell draws on. You know, he's very critical of the hard left for what he sees as its Greco-Roman terminology, its heresy hunting, its authoritarianism in all sorts of ways. But nevertheless, he still is influenced by aspects of the ideas of these movements, and I think you can see it in the writing. What I would argue is that he sticks with Labour once they're in power, even though he finds them very disappointing in terms of the reforms they introduce. You know, he says that most people who voted for them voted for a health service, for better wages, for full employment, for a whole range of reforms that Orwell certainly thinks are important, but he makes clear that these are not socialism. Socialism involves the expropriation of the rich and the establishment of a democratic socialist society rather than capitalism being left in place but the working class being better off. You know, he actually makes that distinction very clear on a number of occasions.
George Orwell's politics have always been contentious. In his lifetime, as we've heard, a notable intellectual contrarian whose antipathy to received wisdom of all kinds made him admirers and enemies across the political spectrum. And since his death, the argument about what he was really about politically has been vigorous and shows no sign of ending soon. 64 years after he died, 65 and a bit after the publication of 1984, people from all parts of the political spectrum still want to appropriate the mantle of Orwell, from those on the left, like John Newsinger, who we heard from this morning, to conservatives who admire him as a Tory anarchist. Orwell's own self-description, I think, are ironic in the early 1930s. Among them, just to take one example, Ferdinand Mount, who gave a 2010 Orwell lecture for the Orwell Prize, entitled Orwell and the Oligarchs, claiming that Orwell was a great admirer of James Burnham, about whom we've heard again this morning from Les. On the other side, there are still those who are not admirers of Orwell, who find different things wrong with him. Leftists who see him as an establishment cold warrior narc, an example, Scott Lucas, for example. Feminists who question his attitudes to women. Conservatives who see him as a delusional leftist. And so we can go on. Okay, and that's before you take into account the vast interpretive literature by writers without any particularly obvious partisan axe to grind or stated political preferences. The two most interesting, to my mind, in the last year, Robert Collis's take on Orwell's life as a struggle with Englishness, George Orwell, English Rebel, which I liked rather more than John, and Peter Wilkins' provocative essay in Political Studies published last year, putting the case for George Orwell, the English dissident, as a Tory anarchist. Does it with some verve, although not, I think, convincingly. And then there are all of those authors, again, some of whom we're hearing from today, engaging with Orwell's concerns with what you might call not quite single issues, but particular issues in politics, from the theory of geopolitics through to surveillance studies. Now, okay, my purpose here is not to attempt to put a stop to this. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't, because all of this will run and run. And, well, one reason for it is that Orwell was a complex and, in many ways, contradictory character who drew on a vast range of personal experience and reading, constantly developing his ideas over time. And he did this, moreover, and this is crucially important, not primarily by issuing political manifestos, although there are actually rather more of those than a lot of people think, but by way of fiction and cultural criticism. Okay? And much of both his fiction and his cultural criticism was designed as satire, okay? As a means of provoking real and imagined critics. Okay? In other words, to put it in modern parlance, he was a wind-up artist. Okay? In the words of the great Joe Strummer, had an absolutely marvellous bullshit detector. Anyway, I don't think Orwell would have used that precise phraseology. Anyway, the other thing, of course, is that people don't read Orwell just for his politics, or even for his politics. He was an exponent of clarity and simplicity of style who will be read long after people forget the battles he fought. Like Michael Gove, dare I say it, but he has actually said it himself, I think Animal Farm will be read in 250 years just as Robinson Crusoe is read today, even though, okay, the political significance of the gripping yarn has been long lost in the mists of time. Anyway, but, okay, that's the throat clearing. For all of that, my argument today is that the best description of Orwell's mature politics remains that given by the late Bernard Crick more than 30 years ago in his seminal Orwell biography, George Orwell, A Life, and that is Tribune Socialism. Orwell was the paper's literary editor from 1943 to 1945, and from 43 to 1947, with a couple of gaps, he contributed a column, mostly under the rubric As I Please, that remains, in my view, and I think in Richard's as well, the model of how to write columns of opinion for newspapers and indeed for any other medium you can choose. I'd add a plug for my collection, but that's already been done by Richard, so I shan't add anything else except that unfortunately you'll have to get it second-hand because it's out of print at the moment. But I hear you ask, what the hell is Tribune Socialism? Well, Tribune was and is the organ of the democratic left in the Labour Party, mainly weekly for most of its history, but in hard times fortnightly, as indeed it is today. And for most of its life, it's been worth reading. It was set up by Sir Stafford Cripps, later a cabinet minister, in 1937, along with others, and, well, it's still publishing. Now, in its first years, it was a dull, communist fellow-travelling rag, frankly, but from 1939-40, a bit too late if you ask me, and actually a bit too late if you'd asked Orwell, who claimed, I think, diplomatically, on the occasion of its 10th anniversary, that he'd been only vaguely aware of the paper's existence in its first 3 years. I think that's completely untrue, but that's another story. There's no evidence to the contrary. But whatever. From 1940, it found a life of its own, and since then, it's been where the Democratic Labour left has fought its battles. It's less visible than it used to be, partly because the Labour left has declined catastrophically, partly because it's very difficult to get small circulation publications distributed today, even more than it was in the 1940s, in fact much more than it was in the 1940s, partly because, of course, as well of the rise of the internet over the last 15 years, with which it's not coped very well. But anyway, it is still there. And, okay, I'm told a relaunch is imminent. Anyway, I have to declare an interest here. I worked for Tribune as a staffer for 7 years, from the mid-80s until the early 90s. The first 5 as reviews editor. George Orwell's unworthy successor was always my line. But anyway, I was very proud of that. And the next 2 as editor. And I was still a contributor and generally proud of it. Now, but, okay, of course, Tribune's politics have changed over time, but since 1940, it has always been a voice for an explicitly democratic socialism. Common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange. Yep. Everything in public ownership. Well, not the corner shop, but just about everything else. And egalitarianism, in other words, people should earn pretty much the same whatever they do, and a culture of freedom of expression, which I describe as libertarian, okay, although the term has been appropriated by rather nasty right-wing characters on the American right in recent years. That said, it is difficult to find consistency in its approach to many, many big issues. On Europe, for example, it's been all over the place. Yeah? It was federalist in the late 1940s, led the anti-common market campaign in the 1970s, went back to federalism in the late 80s, early 90s, then became part of the anti-common market campaign, or whatever it's now called, in the noughties. I mean, effectively, a get out of Europe position. Equally inconsistent, it has to be said, when it comes down to the big questions of the Cold War. So on the Soviet Union, it goes from being uncritically pro-Soviet in the late 1930s to being radically anti-Soviet between 1939 and 1941, to being pretty uncritically, but not completely uncritically pro-Soviet between 1941 and 1945, radically anti-Soviet between then and 1950. Well, anyway, and so I could go on. Okay, it was always split between those optimists who hope for the best from every new leader or apparent thaw in the Soviet bloc, and pessimists who despaired that the Soviet model would bury all hopes for democratic socialism. And of course, these arguments ebbed and flowed right up to the end of the Cold War. Now, whatever, despite all of this, for the last decade and more of his life, I believe Orwell was a free-thinking but hardly atypical Labour libertarian leftist. And to situate him otherwise, it seems to me, is a mistake. When he wrote in Why I Write, which was published in small magazine Gangrel in 1946 and read to next to nobody at the time, although it's now on every other reading list, every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism as I understand it. Okay, I think he was telling the truth. Now, okay, this is something that we can argue about, which is why we're here. But okay, let's look at the evidence. I'm not going to attempt to improve, which looks like I couldn't, on Richard Blair's description of his father's early life. What I would say, though, is there's no real indication that he had much interest in politics until he dropped out of the Indian police and took the decision to become a writer. Went off to Paris, slummed it in the UK. And, well, even then, you know, he's a young man whose ideas are in a process of development. Although, that said, I think it's quite difficult to imagine anyone making the decision that he made unless, okay, he'd been inspired by something or other, you know, to engage with poverty, with imperialism, okay, and with what was wrong with capitalism. I'm afraid that unless some new tranche of letters is discovered in some Southwold attic, though we're going to have to speculate on all of this for the foreseeable future. This in parentheses, and I know I can't do very many parentheses at the moment, is one of the reasons that I'm very much with Crick. I think theories of what made Orwell tick are absolutely fascinating, but I don't really buy, for example, the story that Eric Blair created Orwell as a strange attempt to give himself a dual identity, yeah? As some Oedipal or whatever it might be, transformation or revolt. I think it was a rather banal adoption of a pseudonym simply to avoid embarrassing people that he knew in Southwold. Also a very common thing for writers to do at the time.
So as we've heard today, the phrase Orwellian has often been invoked to describe developments in state power, surveillance, dishonesty and so on. But I want to suggest today that the influence of 1984 in particular extends beyond merely thematic concerns to its narrative structure and those of other dystopian novels. I'm going to take this term Orwellian to mean not just an image of a future fictional world that is a dystopian bad place, but a particular type of narrative, a way of explaining the world and processes in it. To do this, I'll read each of the three parts of 1984 with other dystopian novels. So, part one, notwithstanding the Newspeak appendix, which I will return to, 1984 follows the traditional Victorian three-part structure of a novel. This is significant as an authorial decision. Orwell doesn't do it in all of his other novels. In a letter to his publisher, Frederick Warburg, in 1947, Orwell writes, "This is a novel about the future. That is, it is in a sense a fantasy, but in the form of a naturalistic novel. That is what makes it a difficult job. Of course, as a book of anticipations, it would be comparatively simple to write." Utopias from the late 19th century onwards had gestured towards this naturalism, but the stilted plodding plot of, for example, Bellamy's Looking Backwards, or the overly didactic utopias at times of H.G. Wells do not achieve the level of naturalism of 1984. Indeed, Phil Wegner argues that Orwell's naturalism betrays the influence of novelists like George Gissing rather than the utopians. And this naturalism finds its way into subsequent dystopias. In Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, for example, an ex-English professor, called significantly again Faber, whom the protagonist Montag takes his illicit copy of the Bible to, told him that such books have texture. They have features. This book can go under the microscope. You'd find life under the glass, streaming past in infinite profusion. The more pores, the more truthfully recorded details of life per square inch you can get on a sheet of paper, the more literary you are. That's my definition anyway. Telling detail, fresh detail. These pores show they show the pores in the face of life. In 1984, the sensuously creamy paper of Winston's diary is also described in these skin-like terms. Books, Bradbury's character insinuates, have the texture of life. They are, quotes, like the petals of a flower, a beautiful, delicate, and in some way ephemeral thing. Books also have a living depth, much like the paperweight which Winston buys from Mr. Charrington at the end of part 1 of the novel. A heavy lump of glass which magnifies the piece of coral inside. How small it always was, Winston thinks to himself when he's arrested and it is smashed before his eyes by the thought police. Another connection exists at the intersection of metafiction and literary naturalism. Here, books are rated in terms of truthfully recorded detail, a definition seemingly meant to cover fiction and non-fiction alike. Given that the text which Faber and Montag are discussing is the Bible, one suspects that truthful recording can be interpreted quite widely, however, to mean sort of moral truth or artistic truth, perhaps even what filmmaker Werner Herzog, who often heavily scripts his documentaries, has described as the ecstatic truth. In part 1, Winston Smith arrives at Victory Mansions and commences his rebellion by sitting out of view of the telescreen, writing his diary. In an analepsis, or flashback, he recalls the 2 minutes hate that morning, in the process introducing Minitrue, Goldstein, and the central characters O'Brien and Julia. Chapters 2 and 3 alternate between lunch hour and Victory Mansions, and more of these flashbacks or analepses from Winston's childhood, told through his dreams. The rest of part 1 follows a similar pattern. Free and direct discourse establishes Winston's alienation as he trudges through the events of daily life, through enforced morning exercise or physical jerks, through lunch in the canteen, and so on. Flashbacks tell the story of his childhood, to the future or to the past, to a time when thought is free. He dedicates his diary, and his free time is devoted to this intellectual rebellion. What's interesting, I think, about this structure is the complex temporality it introduces. Winston Smith is trapped in what Irving Howe termed a post-totalitarian society, one after the victory of totalitarianism, and seemingly beyond the end of history with a capital H. And this is what the famous image of a boot on stamping on face forever signifies. But as we move through the novel, the reader is constantly thrown between different time frames, both relating to Winston's own life, his childhood, the photograph of the 3 traitors and so on, and also to wide historical periods, particularly the recent past and post-war present in which Orwell wrote. From the 70s onwards, utopian and dystopian fiction became increasingly complex in terms of this sort of narrative temporality. Feminist writers in particular, reacting in part against the what they saw as a pronounced patriarchy of 1984, used increasingly experimental approaches to temporality, alongside greater ambiguity between positive and negative aspects of their imagined other worlds. Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed is one such example of the tale of 2 planets. The split between different temporal locations is formally marked here, with the chapters alternating in physical setting between the 2 worlds, as the narrative speaks of the dichotomy between them. The inhabitants of the anarcho-syndicalist planet of Uras, we learn in, again, flashback analeptic passages, left the oppressive conditions of the capitalist Anaras during the period of uprising. The novel deals in large part with the consequences of a physicist from Uras becoming the first of his world for several generations to return to Anaras. And this spatial shift also marks a change in the experience of time as revolution breaks out. Again, Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time uses time travel to explore mental illness and liminal psychic spaces. And in an authoritarian realist present, the protagonist, Connie, is kept prisoner in a public mental hospital. She begins to have visions of a utopian future world, and the narrative flows back and forth between the utopia and the heterotopic violence of this mental institute, at one point even including a vision of a more misogynistic and more capitalist alternate future. And there's links here both to traditional utopias and jarring interruptions from a world that resembles both mini-true and mini-love in many respects. It's as if the destabilising of temporality is a key means by which to engage both the dystopian tradition of Orwell and Huxley, while simultaneously critiquing this sort of perceived androcentrism of those very texts. If the first part of this Orwellian structure is about the growing alienation of the protagonist, then the second part involves a romantic attachment or tryst of some kind. Another key element is Goldstein's book, which I don't think I have time to fit in today. But the romance is essentially reworked from Zamyatin, and as with Zamyatin's We, it's never quite certain what the personal feelings and motivations are of either I-330 or of Julia in 1984. In Cory Doctorow's 2008 young adult novel Little Brother, however, the love interest of teenager Marcus Yellow, who uses the online identities of Winston and Mickey successively, becomes one of the few people he can reliably trust. I argued that Doctorow critically engages with the gender relations in 1984 throughout Little Brother. All the strong characters in the novel are women, from Marx's torturer, Carrie Johnston, to his British mother, Lillian, the journalist, Barbara Stratford, and his girlfriend, Angela Carvelli. As in 1984, Ange is both a love interest and a partner in crime. And as with 1984, Ange is herself a highly sexual character, a teenager who is, quotes, as much of a horn dog as Marcus, and often initiates sexual contact. She shares too with Julia a careful intelligence and justified paranoia that helps her to flout rules. I slightly disagree perhaps with John this morning when we were talking about this over lunch, however, that unlike Julia, Ange is also a bit more political as Marcus's partner. In 1984, Julia lies back in the grass in the wood, and Winston realises he could do what he likes with her. But later he tells Julia, only half jokingly, I think, that she is only a rebel from the waist down. Ange, by contrast, is a rebellious hacker who avidly engages with this online community called XNet that Marcus establishes to oppose federal government oppression. It's her idea to hold an anonymous online press conference through a computer game, and much to this 17-year-old Marcus's own surprise, they actually put up having sex in order to participate in this press conference. When Marcus gets tired of the conference, he tells us that he, quotes, handed the keyboard to Ange and let her be Mickey for a while. It didn't really feel like Mickey and me were the same person anymore. Anyway, like Goldstein, Mickey has become an iconic symbol of resistance and vilification that has little to do with real-life identity. Mickey is a networked identity, a set of political ideas. He expresses the thoughts and feelings of an activist network, encouraging others to speak for the movement and reposting and linking to their blogs and their citizen journalism. Little Brother's an interesting little nephew of 1984 for two more reasons. Firstly, because while 1984 is a novel for adults, frequently marketed at and enjoyed by teenage readers, Little Brother is an avowedly young adult novel, frequently read by adults. And secondly, because it's not really a dystopia at all, I would argue, but rather an Orwellian political thriller. The novel does not begin in medias res, it does not posit a leap forward in time beyond a few months or a couple of years at most, and the technology which is explained in detail throughout the novel all exists today. The social transformation to a paranoid society of surveillance occurs when terrorists set off a series of explosions around San Francisco Bay. The novel is heavily didactic, a story of vengeance and restorative justice, and the plot differs in many ways to 1984. However, obvious references to Orwell's novel signal that the narrative itself is responding to 1984. For example, the interrogation, which forms the crux of part 3 of Orwell's novel, is established as a central mode of interaction from the opening of Doctorow's text, when a school vice principal attempts to implicate Marcus in counter-security crimes. Marcus successfully bluffs him, but when he and his friends are hauled off the streets by unmarked Homeland Security agents following a terrorist attack, the interrogation immediately breaks through this teenage braggadocio. This brings me to the dialogue structure of O'Brien's interrogation of Winston. In David Mitchell's acclaimed novel Cloud Atlas, which tells 6 interlinking stories spanning lives from the 1700s to the far future, at least one of these positioned in the Orwellian vein, an orison of Somni 451, obviously a clear reference to Bradbury's text. The entire story is framed as an interview in prison of Somni, a genetically modified clone, an escaped slave from a fast food restaurant, 9 stories below ground in a shopping mall. The interview structure is characteristically, though not distinctively, Orwellian. It's present in previous dystopias, such as Brave New Worlds, Amiatim's We, and ultimately, as Kumar points out, it owes a debt to the brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. Significantly, Somni is an autodidact who teaches herself from a portable electronic device like Winston teaches himself from Goldstein's book. Just like 1984, Brave New World, We, John Wyndham's The Chrysalids, The Hunger Games, so on. In the back history of this dystopia, there's a terrible atomic war, and here called the Skirmish. And as with so many other dystopias, books and films from the past are censored. The university library from which Somni downloads books refuses many requests, but Somni tells her interviewer that she succeeded with 2 optimists translating the late English, Orwell and Huxley, and Washington's satires on democracy. No such work obviously exists by that stalwart Democratic Republican, George Washington, and Orwell and Huxley not commonly regarded as optimists either, though I'd argue there is hope in both of their dystopian novels. This is a signal that these works have been doctored or amended in translation. Who controls the past controls the present. Sorry, who controls the present controls the past, as Oceana would have it. At the end of Somni's story, she reveals that she's understood all along she's been a pawn used by the corporatocracy, an actor in an elaborate game. But as with Doctorow's little brother, she subverts the story which those in power want to project about the revolutionary humanity of clones by use of electronic communication.